Matthew. We thank you for the gift of preaching that you have bestowed upon him. We thank you that you are able to speak to us in human words, and that you give us these words to share with our community of believers. Please open our hearts, our minds, our souls, and our being to what Matthew has for us this morning, and to what you have for us this morning. We ask that you would be with him as he brings us this message.
I'm not a very loud talker, so I need to make sure the amplification is very good. There we go. Have two confessions this morning. Start with a time of confession. The first is the last time I color coordinated my note cards with my shirt. I didn't do that this morning, but I did start with yellow. Yellow means slow down. So slow down at the beginning, take it easy. And I told this to Greta, and she said, but you speed up when you see yellow. So this time I'm slowing down when I see yellow. The second is, I really appreciated the Sunday school this morning, because it's been an interesting experience to work with the text in Sunday school, and then hear it again as the sermon. And as people were noting things, I thought, oh boy, there's my sermon. Oh, there's my sermon again. Oh, well, but I really appreciated the ways that some ideas and themes were fleshed out in there. Also want to thank Wendell for teaching, and Eric and Derek for leading us this morning in worship. So the title of today's sermon, The Poor Man's Kingdom. I want us to keep that idea, that image in our mind, the poor man's kingdom. Who is this poor man, and what does it mean for this poor man to be a king of a kingdom? And I'll say it explicitly now, and maybe say it in quieter ways throughout. I'm talking about Jesus. Jesus is this poor king. And what does it mean for Jesus to be the king of this kingdom? And I also want to say this text, we had some really interesting discussion in Sunday school about, a lot of these interesting questions. What is this text telling us? Why do we have so many questions? And I wanted to state clearly today, my focus for the text is, what does this text tell us about Jesus? We're going to look at the sheep and the goats. We're going to look at some of these other questions. But what is this text teaching us about who Jesus is? With his disciples, with us now, and as a king. What do we learn from this text? And as you know, this is another one of our Dig In series texts that we've been working with, crucial texts to Anabaptists or to Mennonites. And I think this is the only text that deals with the end of the age, or the end of the present age. And I looked through the 13, and I think this is the only one. So this is an interesting text to think about. Jesus is talking about something to come. And how do we wrestle with that with these questions? And speaking of questions, why the sheep and the goats? Why are both groups surprised? And what does it tell us that this is Jesus' last teaching? And we'll get into that a little bit. But all these questions that we have, and maybe the most important question, who are the least of these? Jesus says this. Who is Jesus actually talking about when he says the least of these? And again, just to reaffirm, if Jesus is this poor king, what does this text tell us about Jesus? How do we learn something about Jesus from this text?
I don't know. Just
So here we are, as Eric read today, Matthew 25. And I'm going to be using Matthew in at least 3 different ways today. So we have Matthew, the book of the Bible. I'm going to reference Matthew, the disciple, and I'm Matthew. So we'll try to keep it straight. We won't get confused with which Matthew we're talking about. But as Eric read, we have what is often in your Bible above this section is labeled the judgment of the nations. This is the scene that we have today. And we'll get into a little bit of that, but before we get into the scene, I want to look at how we get there. Where does this story fit in Jesus' teachings that we've looked at, Matthew 5, we've looked at a number of the other teachings. Where does this one fit? And this teaching, which is combined with a little bit of Matthew 24 into Matthew 25, where we are today, is often looked at as the last teaching, the last of Jesus' major teachings. The first one, the Sermon on the Mount. We looked through that, Matthew 5 through 7. The second one, Matthew 10, where Jesus prepares disciples to go. And he sends them on a mission. He sends them to proclaim the gospel. The third one, Jesus teaches about parables of the kingdom of heaven. And we'll get into those a little bit. The fourth, sincere discipleship. You've probably all heard Matthew 18. If you have a conflict with a brother or sister, go directly. Go directly and talk to that brother or sister, not talk behind the back or talk with someone else. Go directly. So about sincere discipleship. But today, Jesus is talking about the end of the current age. So we're not talking necessarily about a parable, and we're not necessarily talking about a public address to all the people. Jesus is talking to the disciples about what is to come, about what will be coming. So what do we have here? Matthew 25. We start out verse 1. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. And Jesus tells this story of the bridesmaids who are waiting for, the wedding or waiting for the celebration. And often in these stories we see the disciples not really getting it. They just don't seem to understand what Jesus is telling it. So today I'd like to think of Matthew. Now this is Matthew the tax collector. Just sitting in the back, he was a tax collector. He knew how to keep good records. Okay, this is important. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. I should write this down. And he's writing and writing. What does this mean? I don't understand this story. Why? But I need to write it down. I need to take good notes. And then he goes again. Chapter 25, verse 14. For it is as if a man going on a journey. And he tells the story of the talents. And giving 3 servants different responsibilities. And Matthew's there taking notes. Oh, I need to learn this. This is important. And you get to the end of that story. What does this mean? I don't know what this means. And now we get to today's story. Chapter 25, verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory. Oh, this is important. This is good. Okay, definitely take notes about this. And you hear this reading that Eric read. What does this mean? And we come to the end. Now what? So we have these 3 parables that end with this judgment of the nation. These 3 stories. What does this mean? How is this heard? And more importantly, what does it tell us about Jesus? Now, to have some understanding of these questions, we have to try to think and imagine about where Matthew and the other disciples are hearing this story, are hearing this teaching. So, where is this story taking place? Where is it happening? Anybody know? Anybody want to guess? Is it in Harrisonburg? Not yet. We'll get to that. It's in Jerusalem. It's in Jerusalem. The disciples have walked with Jesus for these few years, and Jesus has entered in glory into the city. Oh, Matthew the tax collector. Oh, this makes sense. Okay, we've entered in glory, and Jesus is going to be king. Okay, I see how this makes sense. I get this. But how did he enter into Jerusalem? He entered on a donkey. He didn't enter. Now, people were waving branches and celebrating, but Jesus didn't really act like that sort of king. He did different things. He's the poor man, and his kingdom will be different. So the disciples now, they're hearing these stories and they're thinking, oh, okay, we're coming into Jerusalem. There will be a kingdom. Jesus will be king. But what kind of king will Jesus be? in thinking about this context, we know this story, Jesus teaches this, and they move to the Passion Week. And we know the crucifixion and the resurrection is coming. But the disciples, they don't know this. Well, Jesus has told them, but they don't really understand it. They've been taking notes, but not comprehending. I think one important thing, we've talked about the context of, it's in Jerusalem. It's in this time, moving into the Passion Week. But I think it's really important to understand this story in the context of Matthew, and also in the Matthew, the book of the Bible, and also the context of Jewish teaching. Now, as Eric said, we've been reading a lot of Deuteronomy this semester. And one thing that is consistent in Deuteronomy is sort of a teaching how to walk, or a teaching how to live. Last time I preached, I talked about ethics and halakha, or walking, how Jews would talk about ethics. And these words that Jesus is saying, I would like to say are words for life. And I think harken back to other words for life in Deuteronomy that I'd like to read. This is Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 45 through 47. And the speaker in this context is Moses. Moses has been giving this address to the Israelite people to prepare them for this next step, for moving into the promised land. And the words he has given them, God has said, if you do these things, you will have life and I will be with you. Very clear instructions on how to live. And these are Moses' last words. When Moses had finished reciting all these words to Israel, he said to them, take to heart all the words that I am giving in witness against you today, that I am giving to you. Give them as a command to your children, so that they may diligently observe all the words of this law. And when it says law, we want to think of teaching. This is teaching that Moses is giving and that Jesus is giving. This is no trifling matter for you, but rather your very life. Though through it you may live long in the land that you are crossing over the Jordan to possess. Moses was giving a word for life, was concluding his teaching with these words for the people to remember. I think Jesus is giving this teaching at the end of parables, of living with the disciples, of walking with them, and he's giving them this last teaching and saying, this is what is coming. This will help you understand, and it is so important to remember these that it will shape your life. These are words for life that you must take with you. In preparing for the sermon this week, I came up with all these questions and talked with some friends. I remember talking with Jerry a while ago and saying, there's all these questions. How do you answer all these questions? And I thought, okay, I just won't answer them. I'll just throw them there and we'll think about them and everybody will think about them. And I was listening to a wise person this week and she told me, you should answer some of those questions. Like, you've researched, you've thought, you've reflected, you've prayed. You should answer some of these questions. So I will listen to that wise person. And I think there are 4 questions that I want to put some answer to this morning. The first question, this image of sheep and goats. Sheep and goats. Now, does anyone here work with sheep and or goats? One person. Okay. Like, I've worked with cows before, but sheep and goats is a little strange to me. I don't have a lot of experience working with sheep and goats. Now, in the first century, they were an agrarian community. There were animals. Maybe sheep and goats make sense. But I want to put forth that naming something as this or that, sheep or goats, is a very, we have another Matthean way, a very Matthew way in the book of Matthew of describing situations. In chapter 3, Jesus talks about the wheat and the chaff. Again, 2 examples. In chapter 13, Jesus talks about the wheat and the weeds. And again in chapter 13, Jesus uses the example of good and useless fish. So this example is in this pattern of teaching. And I'm good and useless fish. I'm not sure about that one. But this sheep and goats is another example of this kind of teaching. So there's the answer for that. The second one, and I think this is the one where I like it to remain a question. But the second one is, both groups are surprised. Both groups say, when did we see you? When did we give you food? Or when didn't we visit you in prison? When did we see this? And I think that can create very tricky living. Oh, where is Jesus? I need to be looking. I don't want to miss Jesus anytime. But I want to argue that this is an example of a way of writing. It's not necessarily an example that we're not seeing Jesus. It's simply a style of writing that is saying, this is the situation. We don't know where we will see Jesus. It's not to cause us to think we will never see Jesus. But I'd love to keep talking about that one afterwards. Question number C. Who are the least of these? Question number C. Doesn't work? Lots of questions. Who are the least of these? Now, as someone rightly named, I think, in Sunday school today, in Matthew, Jesus, when he uses this phrase, the least of these, he's talking about his brothers and sisters, the disciples who he is sending out, who he knows will face very difficult circumstances, may not be welcomed, may not be given water, may not have food. This is a very difficult situation they are being put into. And the least of these means not only will you struggle, but society might look down on you. Because of this path you are taking, these words of life that you are choosing to follow, there will be some hardship. Now, there are lots of other definitions of the least of these, but I want to work with that one. The people sent by Jesus who are seeking to live the words that Jesus taught us how to live. And I want to keep that nice and broad. The last thing. Why does Jesus end with this teaching? Now, we're often taught, if you write a paper, you say your introduction, and then you say the same thing at the end. Really hit that point. So why didn't Jesus do the Sermon on the Mount again? Hit the same thing. The same thing. I think he ended with this word for life, similar to what Moses ended with, because he knew this was the preparation that the disciples needed. They were being sent out. They were going to be strangers. They were going to encounter strangers. And this is what they needed for this time. It was not a proclamation like the Sermon on the Mount. It was a message to his disciples. And because of that, I think we need to take very seriously this word for life that Jesus gives us. Well, now that we've answered all the questions, we can get to the heart of the issue, right here. And I'm done with yellow cards, so it might speed up now. One of the questions that I came from this text, after wrestling with this text, was, I struggle with this image of a courtroom. We have the king on the throne judging. But this is Jesus. This is a poor king. This was a poor man. And for me, anytime I see someone on a throne, they don't look poor. They look draped in robes. They have a crown. They have a scepter. They're commanding people. Maybe they have a royal cup, from which to drink from. But that's not Jesus. Jesus is a poor king. So how do we take this image of a courtroom with the image of the cross? How do we hold these things? How does this work? Now, maybe some of you have images of courtrooms from personal experience, from TV, from movies. Often when I think of a courtroom, I think of the people are real, the cases are real, the rulings are final. Judge Judy, right? Like Judge Judy, right there. I mean, that's an image from TV, but that's an image of a courtroom. She sits there, she makes quick decisions, she makes sharp decisions, and the rulings are final. That's a judge. But how does that connect with Jesus as a judge, as a poor king? The two don't The two don't mesh for me. I don't think Jesus is that type of judge. What is Jesus' message? If the important thing is what this says about Jesus, Jesus' mission is to redeem and restore. How does that fit with judgment? How do we hold those two things? One way that I think we hold those two things is by looking at two key verses. And I wrote the verses here, but I want to make sure the reading is exactly correct. In Matthew 25, the first one is verse 40. And these are called the Amen sayings. So I don't know if you have to say amen after we read them, but these are key points. So verse 40, the righteous have just said, "When did we see you? When did we know we were doing these things for you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Members of my family. How do we love members of our family? That's what Jesus is calling us to. Now, if we flip that, verse 45. People have just said the same thing. "When did we see you? We didn't not visit you in prison. We didn't know you were there." And Jesus says, "Then he will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did not do to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me.'" When we reflect on this passage, I don't think we come away with, let's just do good things. In the Jewish teachings in Deuteronomy, in the book of Matthew, in Jesus' teachings, we are called to live a certain way, and there are consequences for not responding to this call, to these words for life. What Matthew is talking about here, the book of Matthew, what the book of Matthew is talking about here is the true church, this true Israel that the church is called to fulfill. Jesus is teaching his disciples to follow these calls, to be faithful to Christ, and to serve Christ and welcome him wherever Christ is. So if Jesus is the king and the judge, and this is a poor man's kingdom, this is Jesus' kingdom, how do we hold this teaching? How do we follow the teaching of the cross and wrestle with the image of judgment? One way that one writer has tried to wrestle with this idea is through a story called Martin the Cobbler. Has anyone ever heard of Martin the Cobbler? A couple hands. All right. So the story of Martin the Cobbler, or Martin the Shoemaker, goes that the shoemaker was a very poor man whose both his wife and his daughter had passed away. This man was a hard worker and had really suffering this difficult experience. But one day he was visited by someone and said, you should read the scriptures. You should take this seriously. So Martin began to read. Slowly at first, but slowly he began to read more and more. And one night, he had a vision. And in the vision, he experienced someone saying, "Jesus is going to visit you tomorrow." Martin woke up, prepared everything to host Jesus, to welcome Jesus, and he got to work. And normally, he would look out the window and he could only see the shoes of people. But he knew people by their shoes. But today, he moved his chair a little closer so he could see more of people, so he could see Jesus when Jesus came. And as he was sitting there, Jesus hadn't come, he saw a woman struggling to carry things. She didn't have enough food that day. So he ran out and he said, come in. Let's have lunch together. And they ate together, and she went home. And he said, well, Jesus isn't here yet. So he went back closer to the window, and he saw a boy and a woman quarreling. And he went and listened and worked with them, and they were able to resolve their conflict. But he looked at his watch, and the day is almost over, and Jesus hasn't come yet. So he goes back to work, and he sees a man walking who doesn't have shoes. And he helps the man find a pair of shoes that fit. And at the end of the day, he was a bit disappointed. Where was Jesus? Jesus was supposed to come and visit me today, and Jesus hasn't come. And Martin went to bed a little sad, tired, he'd had a hard day. And as he went to sleep, he realized that Jesus had visited him today. Jesus was in the woman and the child, the woman who was struggling, and the man who didn't have shoes. Now, this brings up lots of questions, I think, that we may need to get into after the sermon. But I think one of the things that we take away from this text, this judgment of the nations, is that Jesus is with us. One of the realities of the poor man, who is also a king, is his commitment to be with us. And we don't